Senator Cormann.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President. Mr. Acting Deputy President, another day and we're debating another tax from the Socialist Green government. Another day and we're debating another attack on personal freedom from the Socialist Green government. Back in 2005, the Howard Coalition government gave students across Australia a tax cut. Back in 2005, the Howard government ensured that students across Australia were able to benefit, like anybody else, from the important freedom, the freedom of association. And of course, back in 2005, the Howard Coalition government ensured that students across Australia had the freedom to choose which services they wanted to access on campus and of course, which services they were prepared to pay for. Let's make no mistake. What we're talking about here today is a tax. It is a tax on students to be imposed by this Labor Green government. It's a $1 billion tax over the current budget cycle. And of course, this is a high-taxing, high-spending government. It's a government that has got higher taxes as part of its DNA. We had the Henry Tax Review tell us that we had too many taxes, that we had 125 taxes in Australia, that 10 of those taxes collect 90% of the revenue, that we should have fewer taxes. And guess what? Since then, since the Henry Tax Review has suggested that we should have fewer than the 125 taxes that we've got around at present, this government has come up with at least another 5. We're talking about the mining tax, the carbon tax, the flat tax, the student tax, the new tax on LPG. Now, this is just one of many taxes, and of course students are now listed, they're now there in a line with everybody else, being on the receiving end of the worst aspects of this high-spending, high-tech taxing government. Now, I chair the Senate Scrutiny of New Taxes Committee on behalf of the Senate, and we have inquired into this tax. And of course, the Senate Scrutiny of New Taxes Committee has been rather busy because this is a government that does consistently come up with yet another tax. But of course, as we started to inquire into this student tax, government senators on the committee were trying to argue that somehow this is not a tax. It's a fee. It's a fee, they said. It's a fee for service. But, Mr. Deputy President, a fee for service is payable when you access the service. A fee for service is something that you pay when you use the service. It's something you don't pay when you don't use the service. And I just draw senators' attentions to the Merriam-Webster's Dictionary of Law, which defines a tax as, and I quote, a charge usually of money imposed by legislative or other public authority upon persons or property for public purposes. This is exactly what is happening here. It is a compulsory levy, it is a compulsory charge which is supposed to be imposed by legislation which has been put forward by this Labor Green government, and it's to be payable irrespective of whether a service is accessed or not. So it is supposedly a levy which will fund the services provided for public purposes. Now, if the government thinks these services are so important, maybe they need to reprioritise some of their other spending. Maybe they need to reprioritise their spending on things like pink butts and school halls and all these other things that this government is so good at wasting money on. Maybe they need to have a look at their $350 billion budget, and find some things that they can reprioritise so that they can fund the services that obviously senators on the Labor side and senators like Senator Hanson-Young think that they're so important. Right. Why should all students have to pay for the services that Senator Hanson-Young values, irrespective of whether they access them or not? They shouldn't. They shouldn't be required to. And of course, this is the crux of this issue. This bill does not introduce a fee-for-service arrangement. If it was a genuine fee-for-service arrangement, students would be offered choice whether to access the service and pay for it or whether not to. This is a compulsory levy to impose by a socialist green government legislation which the universities would be required to collect as tax collectors. Now, senators on the government side, Labor and Green senators, have said, well, universities support this. Well, what a surprise. I mean, universities are in this with the government. They are going to be the tax collectors that are going to be collecting the tax. And they are, of course, seeing a benefit in this for them. Has anybody asked the students on the government side? Let me tell you what the students think about this. Because out of the submissions received by our committee, well, 89% of students making a submission to our Scrutiny of New Taxes Committee were opposed to this tax. Now, further, I mean, the Australian Democrats actually went out of their way in their Australian Democrats youth poll when this issue first came up to survey students. Maybe the Greens are so removed now from what happens on campus that they've sort of lost touch with where students are at. Maybe you should do a survey. Right. Maybe Senator Hanson-Young should do a survey on campus to find out what students really want. Maybe Senator Hanson-Young needs to spend a bit more time on campus and ask students whether they want to pay another tax, irrespective of whether they will access the services that are to be funded by it or not. And of course, the Australian Democrats Youth Poll 2008 showed that 59% of those surveys did not believe that voluntary student unionism legislation should be reversed. Now, Madam Acting Deputy President, this is of course a broken promise, yet again. Yet again. I mean, if this is such a good idea, if it's such a good idea to slug students with another tax, if it is such a popular thing to do, if the services are so important, if they're going to be so valued, if this is such a great concept, why didn't the Labor government tell us before the 2007 election that was something they would do? In fact, this is what the Shadow Minister for Education said at the time when he was asked about it. Are you planning to introduce compulsory student unionism? Are you looking at reversing the voluntary student unionism arrangements? No, well, and this is a quote, no, well, firstly, I'm not considering a HEC-style arrangement. I'm not considering a compulsory HEC-style arrangement. And the whole basis of the approach is one of a voluntary approach. So I'm not contemplating a compulsory amenities fee. So, I mean, there's a theme here. Why is it that the Labor Party before an election tells us they're not going to introduce a tax, and then after an election they do? Why is it that they keep deceiving people around Australia about what their true intentions are when it comes to taxes like this one? Because they know that people will hate it. That is exactly right, Senator Nash. Because if they told people the truth before an election about their high taxing intentions, about their high taxing plans, they of course know that people would not support them. And so this is where we are. Now, this is of course a tax that has been considered by the Senate before. This is a tax which has been voted down by the Senate before. This is a tax which has been put forward by the government before and has been rejected by the Senate before. And of course, the Senate should reject this tax again. Now, looking at the makeup of the chamber, I'm not confident the Senate will. And students across Australia will be on the receiving end of the Labor-Greens alliance which will come to play in this chamber. Students across Australia every year when they pay this tax should remember that this is a tax that has been imposed on them by Labor and Green senators in this chamber. This is the Sarah Hanson-Young tax. This is going to be the Sarah Hanson-Young tax, Madam Acting Deputy President, because it is, of course, the Greens that are going to make sure that this bad tax will get through this chamber. Now, I will walk up and down the campuses of Australia.
Senator Cormann, perhaps as a chair, first of all, you can direct your comments through me, but the person you're referring to is a senator of this chamber, so you could refer to her as Senator Hanson-Young. Thank you very much, while I'm in the chair.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I understand and accept. And of course, I don't think that Senator Hanson-Young was that concerned, Madam Acting Deputy President, by the way, about my description of this tax as a Senator Hanson-Young tax. And of course, I will make sure in the years between now and the next election that students across Australia know that it is Senator Hanson-Young and the Greens that have ensured that this high-taxing Labor government was able to get this tax through the Senate, because coalition senators, Liberal Party and National Party senators have stood firm against this latest tax like from the current Australian Labor government. And we will continue to stand firm and protect freedoms and protect and ensure lower taxes on student campuses. Now, let's just make a few things clear. Voluntary student unionism has been an absolute success. Voluntary student unionism has been an absolute success. Now, let's just make sure right up front, voluntary student unionism hasn't been about abolishing student unions, nothing of the sort. Student unions have existed under compulsory student unionism. They continue to exist under voluntary student unionism. Student unions continue to be able to charge fees. Yes, they've got to demonstrate value. They've got to demonstrate that they've got a service that people actually want to buy. They've got to convince students that the things they stand for actually are the things that the student supports. But you see, I mean, Senator Brown is now interjecting, saying that this is just ridiculous, she says. Well, Senator Brown clearly doesn't understand what it's like to be forced to pay for something you do not support, to be forced to pay for something that you don't access. If you're a financially struggling student, it is arrogant, it is offensive, it is completely inappropriate for a government like this one to force you to pay for something you don't value, you don't support, and you won't access. Why should you? If those services are so important, if those services are going to be valued, there's one or two things can happen. Either they're such important public services that they're provided by government, and many people in the community, and indeed students, can and will access those services through Centrelink, Legal Aid, and various other government services that are available. If those services are services to be provided to students on campus, well, if they're not attractive enough, if they're not responding to a genuine need, then maybe they shouldn't be provided. If they are attractive enough, if they are responding to a genuine need, then students will pay for them when they access the service. Now, I mean, it's been quite interesting because, I mean, I've sort of been listening to the debate, and Senator Billick was saying that somehow we don't care about students because what's been happening is that coffee on some campus in Tasmania now costs $6. Coffee now costs $6, and some other senator said that drinks at the bar are now more expensive, and food is no longer subsidised, food is more expensive. Well, the logical implication of your argument is that you want all these students who are not going to buy coffee at the student union, that you want students that are not going to go to the bar at the student union, that are not going to go and eat food at the student union. You want all of those students that are not going to access the service to pay for it for those that will. That's what, the only way you can make it cheaper by having a compulsory levy is if you're working on the express and explicit assumption, that there will be a whole bunch of students that are not going to go and buy a coffee or buy a drink or buy some food at this particular student union-run coffee shop. That's the only way. That is the only way you can make sure you can make it cheaper for those who will. Because, I know the Labor Party is bad at maths, but not even Senator Conroy can be this bad at maths. Like, if you're going to provide a service and you're going to want to make it
Senators, cheaper... Order. Thank you.
If you want to make access
Senator Cormann.
I'm sorry, you
order. Senator's order. Senator Cormann, please continue, and I'm sure people will listen appropriately. Senator Brown, and Senator Mason.
Now,
Senator Cormann, I'm not going to call you till I think other people are ready to listen.
Could be a while.
Thanks, Senator Cormann.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I totally agree with you. It is very important that other people listen, in particular Senator Conroy, because I've read in the media on the weekend that he's very influential with this government, and maybe he can convince the Prime Minister that this really is a very bad idea. This is a really bad idea. And or maybe he can do some work on the Prime Minister in waiting. The member, don't know which seat he's in actually, Mr. Shorten, Mr. Bill Shorten, isn't he the Labor Prime Minister in waiting? You know, your friend. Anyway, like this is a very this is a very bad idea. This is a very bad tax. This is a tax which will reduce student freedom of association, which will force students to pay for services they won't access, which will actually not. And I mean, what is the problem that you're actually trying to fix? Now, I mean, in my home state of Western Australia, we've actually got a great tradition when it comes to voluntary student unionism, because there was a great government in Western Australia, a court government, with the Education Minister Norman Moore at the time introducing voluntary student unionism back in 1993. So university campuses in Western Australia have got a longer tradition when it comes to voluntary student unionism. And of course, which means that university campuses in Western Australia were actually able to thrive under the voluntary student unionism arrangements introduced by the Howard government. Because after voluntary student unionism was introduced in Western Australia, the student unions had to restructure and had to change their focus. They actually had to provide services that people wanted. Hey, that's a novel thing. Provide services that people wanted. They had to be responsive to genuine student need. That's a pretty novel thing, isn't it, Senator Conroy? Now let's just be very clear. This is a government that is not only is it a high taxing government which is looking at students as just another target for its high taxing ways. It is also a government that wants to do the bidding of its left wing mates on student campuses. You know, its left wing mates on student campuses are not able to raise their own money from students voluntarily. I mean, unless you force people to pay to join one of these left-wing outfits, people won't join and won't pay. Yeah, I mean, so what do? We're in government, and you know we've just happened to have a Labor-Green alliance in the Senate. So let's use the opportunity. Let's use the opportunity to force students to pay this compulsory levy, and that way we don't have to go through this pesky effort of actually trying to convince people that what we're doing is legitimate, that what we're doing is providing, is responding to a genuine need. Now, here was another one. So, some Labor senator actually during the debate said that voluntary student unionism was all about snuffing out student representation which was opposed to the conservative agenda of the Howard government. But it's nothing of the sort. I don't care what agendas students pursue when they're on university campus, and I'm sure that Senator Conroy would have been very active in the Labor movement on campus. Great, that's fantastic. But I don't think that every other student who doesn't agree with his views should pay for it, should be forced to pay for it. I don't think that our government should force students that don't agree with the views of students like the Senator Conroys of today, whether it's on the Australian National University campus or the University of Western Australia campus. I don't think that the Australian government should force students who don't agree with the Senator Conroys of today to pay a compulsory levy to fund his activities. They shouldn't. Now here, the government says we've got all these safeguards, and no, this can't be used for political activity. Well, the only thing that student unions will be stopped from using this money for is direct political campaigning for candidates to election. Now, you don't have to be Einstein to know that. This is a gate that is so large that every single left-wing union representative, every single left-wing student will be able to walk through that in 5 seconds. You don't have to be studying physics to know how you get through a gate that is that large. You don't have to have a PhD in physics to get through that one. Everybody knows that there's different ways of skinning a cat. You don't have to campaign for a candidate directly to be pursuing a political campaign. Now, let me just stress here again. I don't care about. Students are entitled to pursue their political views. Students are entitled to associate and organise themselves and campaign, and try and. Quite frankly, student associations are entitled, in my view, to campaign against sitting members of parliament, for somebody, against somebody, for a government, against the government. There's nothing wrong with that. But the Australian government shouldn't be forcing others to pay for the activities of those students if they don't agree with them. If you want to be, you beg to differ. You see, Senator Brown begs to differ. Senator Brown, on behalf of the government, does think that all students should pay the activities of the few that happen to have a view that they don't agree with. Well, that is a fundamental problem with this Labour Green government. They just abuse the power that they've got at present by being the Australian government. They abuse it to force all students across Australia to fund organisations for the few at the expense of the many. And of course, Senator Mason very eloquently talked about the million or so higher education students, which had many of them don't even, and I'm sure that Senator Mason will move an extension of time. But let me just summarise. This is a bad tax from a bad government, and of course the Senate should again oppose it.
Your time has expired, Senator Cormann.